The ridge was silent at first light. A grey Pacific haze clung to the treetops, shifting loosely in the warm air rising from the jungle below. Palm shadows stretched across the broken earth, where shell fragments and burnt foliage marked the route of the previous night's fighting. The humidity pressed down like a weight, muffling every distant sound, until a single metallic clank echoed across the slope. It came from an American field gun positioned behind a collapsed tree trunk, its trail legs dug deep into the soil. The weapon stood alone, its crew scattered during the night's confusion, its position nearly overrun. Only one man remained beside it, sweat-streaked, exhausted, and working with the cold precision that comes from hours of drilled routine. Down the narrow valley, the rumble began. Engines, multiple engines. A Japanese transport column, 7 trucks, moving fast, unaware the gun still had a man behind it. The lone gunner steadied his stance, adjusted the elevation wheel, and prepared the next round. The jungle vibrated with the convoy's approach, each second drawing them closer into the weapon's arc. And this moment, this quiet breath before impact, forms the beginning of everything that followed, leading directly into the wider story behind it. The ridge where the lone gunner stood was only a fragment of a much larger battlefield, one shaped by months of grinding movement, fractured supply lines, and the constant contest for control of narrow island corridors. By the time this moment occurred, the Pacific War had forced both sides into a deadly pattern. Every height mattered, every trail mattered, and every gun that remained operational, no matter how isolated, could alter the course of an entire day's fighting. American forces had pushed inland from a beachhead carved out under fire. Their objective was straightforward on paper: secure the ridge, establish observation over the valley road, and cut the main Japanese supply artery that fed troops deeper in the interior. But nothing in the Pacific ever unfolded as simply as it looked on the maps. The terrain was a commander's nightmare: steep slopes, dense jungle, limited visibility, trails so narrow that even a single truck could choke movement for hours. For weeks, Japanese units had used this road to move ammunition, rations, and reinforcement platoons forward. Every convoy that survived the journey allowed frontline positions to hold a little longer. Every loss placed new pressure on officers already struggling to maintain cohesion in terrain that swallowed entire formations. American artillery was the primary tool used to interdict these supply lines. Crews manning 75 Marnals and 105mm field pieces were expected to haul their guns through mud, lash them to whatever stable ground they could find, and fire with speed and discipline even when Japanese infiltration units approached dangerously close. Positions changed constantly. Maps lost relevance. Survival often depended on instinct as much as planning. The gun featured in this story had been part of a small battery assigned to provide covering fire for an infantry company advancing along the ridge. But during the night, Japanese troops had launched a coordinated attack, probing the perimeter, cutting wire, exploiting gaps in the darkness. Confusion spread along the line. Some crews were forced to displace. Others withdrew to secondary positions. Several were separated entirely. By dawn, the battery no longer existed in any organized sense. The men were scattered. The radios were silent. The ridge was still contested. Yet the gun itself remained intact, unmoved, uncaptured. A 75mm pack howitzer, a weapon designed specifically for terrain like this, capable of being broken down, carried by mules or dragged by hand, then reassembled amid thick brush. Its short barrel made it less accurate than heavier guns, but its mobility made it invaluable in jungle warfare. A single man couldn't operate it at full speed, but one man who understood its mechanisms could still fire it deliberately, carefully, and effectively. The situation around the ridge made such an act necessary. Japanese units had slipped behind parts of the American line, attempting to cut the advance by targeting supply and command elements. To secure the position, American troops needed at least a few hours to reorganize, re-establish communication, and push reinforcements forward. If Japanese supply convoys continued to run freely through the valley, their infantry on the heights would maintain pressure, making consolidation nearly impossible. This is what placed extraordinary value on one operational gun, and one gunner who refused to abandon it. The Japanese convoy that began moving up the valley that morning belonged to a logistical detachment responsible for delivering ammunition and water to frontline battalions. Their drivers were accustomed to danger. They traveled in exposed trucks with open backs, vulnerable from the moment the engine started. But in jungle warfare, movement was often safest at speed. get through the dangerous zone before American scouts or artillery spotters could react. They didn't expect a functional artillery piece on the ridge. Reports from the night attack had suggested the American battery had been broken. Japanese officers believed the height had at least been partially neutralized. Enough, at least, for a convoy to make the morning run. What they didn't know was that the man remaining at the gun had survived the night attack by inches. When the position nearly collapsed, he had dug himself behind the shield, loaded one last round, and waited. When the firing stopped, he found himself alone, no orders. No officers, no voice on the handset, just the gun, the ammunition crate scattered around it, and the valley road still within range. He stayed because abandoning the ridge meant giving up one of the few vantage points his division possessed, and because every truck that passed unchallenged brought more Japanese firepower closer to the Americans fighting below. As dawn lifted and the distant rumble of engines echoed upward, he understood exactly what that sound meant: supply movement, reinforcement, momentum shifting if they got through. And so the solitary figure behind the gun prepared himself for a task normally assigned to an entire crew, setting the stage for the angles that defined this moment. The first angle is the human one, the physical reality of a lone gunner operating a weapon built for an entire crew. A 75 mu pack howitzer is not a light instrument. It demands strength to haul ammunition, precision to set elevation, coordination to swab the barrel, load the round, and relay the sights after every recoil. Normally, 6 men worked in practiced rhythm to keep the gun firing at tempo. But on that ridge, there was no rhythm left, only one man cycling through every task with the slow, deliberate pace that exhaustion allows. His arms were shaking from the night's fighting, his hearing muted from nearby detonations, his hands burned from metal that had never fully cooled. But he stayed anchored to the weapon, because leaving it would expose the valley to unchallenged movement. The physical toll was immense, yet he worked with the mechanical calm of someone who understood both the value and the vulnerability of his position, grounding the moment in the raw endurance demanded by jungle warfare, because the next angle expands the battlefield beyond the man and into the terrain itself. The second angle is tactical. The ridge overlooked a narrow valley road, one of the few routes through which Japanese forces could move supplies at speed. Artillery observers had identified it earlier in the campaign as a natural choke point, and that was why the American battery had been placed there in the first place. When the Japanese night attack scattered the crews, the position didn't lose significance, it simply became unmanned. From a tactical perspective, even one functioning gun on that height posed a direct threat to Japanese operational flow. A single hit on the lead truck could stop the entire convoy, turning the column into a row of stalled, exposed vehicles. The jungle's density meant no alternate route existed. The road was everything: lifeline, artery, the connection between frontline troops and their ammunition. Japanese commanders relied on speed to minimize exposure, believing the night attack had eliminated the threat. This assumption was reasonable under the circumstances, but ultimately incorrect, setting the stage for an unexpected artillery strike that would prove how quickly tactical momentum could shift when a single weapon remained in the fight, leading naturally into the third angle where technology defined opportunity. The third angle is technological, the characteristics of the 75mm pack howitzer that made this moment possible at all. It was a weapon designed for mobility. Crews in the Pacific relied on it precisely because it could be dragged up ridges that vehicles couldn't reach. Its short barrel reduced recoil enough that a lone operator could physically manage it if necessary. Its relatively small shells could be carried by hand in wooden crates stacked near the firing position. Even more important was its arc. The gun could be depressed and elevated quickly, allowing the operator to engage targets on steep approaches or in tightly confined valleys. These characteristics gave it a unique advantage in the terrain. A heavier 105mm howitzer could not have been positioned there. A mortar lacked the flat trajectory needed for direct fire at trucks. A machine gun would have lacked penetration. Only the pack howitzer could deliver a decisive, high explosive strike at convoy range from an elevated slope, precise enough to hit a line of moving vehicles, powerful enough to shatter their engines and frames, and sturdy enough to remain functional after hours of near-constant tension. This weapon, built for mobility, was uniquely suited for one man to exploit in the exact situation unfolding below, linking directly to the fourth angle, where leadership decisions on both sides shaped the conditions of the encounter. The fourth angle is leadership, how command expectations and battlefield assumptions influenced every movement leading to the moment. American officers had positioned artillery forward because they needed suppression on the ridges to protect infantry advancing through the valley. They accepted the risk of pushing guns close to the front line, knowing that their loss would be costly but their presence essential. When the night attack broke the battery, the officers couldn't reorganize immediately. Communication lines had been severed, runners delayed, and the jungle swallowed formations before commanders could regain control. Japanese leadership faced its own pressures. They knew their frontline troops were low on ammunition and water. They needed the convoy to reach them before the next American push. They believed the ridge had been neutralized based on reports from the infiltration units. Their decision to move at dawn rather than wait for confirmation reflected a constant reality of jungle warfare. Hesitation carried its own risks. Thus, both sides acted logically within their circumstances. But leadership decisions, American, Japanese, and the individual resolve of the gunner converged in a way that made the confrontation inevitable, bringing forward the fifth angle, the enemy perspective, shaped by visibility, expectation, and shock. The fifth angle is the enemy angle, how Japanese drivers and infantry interpreted what unfolded. To the convoy moving along the valley road, the ridge was simply another contested height, one they believed had been sufficiently cleared for safe passage. They had no reason to expect an operational artillery piece. They saw jungle canopy, broken earth, and the outlines of terrain that looked unchanged from the night before. When the first round struck, the reaction was immediate confusion. The sound of an artillery shell arriving from above was distinct, a sudden tearing roar followed by impact, not the rising whistle associated with long-distance fire. This meant the gun was close, very close. To the Japanese soldiers, the idea that a lone artilleryman could still be operating a full-size howitzer at direct fire range bordered on unbelievable. It contradicted every assumption made during the night operation. The shock wasn't only in the destruction of the convoy, it was in the realization that a position they thought broken had remained functional because a single gunner had refused to abandon it. That disbelief would shape the intensity of their response, pushing the battle toward its unavoidable turning point. The convergence of these five angles, human endurance, tactical geography, technological suitability, leadership decisions, and enemy expectations, formed the tension that now pressed toward the moment when everything changed. The valley held its breath in the seconds before the shot. The lone gunner stood behind the shield, one hand on the traversing mechanism, the other steadying the elevation wheel. He had already measured the approach of the convoy in his mind, calculating distance by the rise and fall of engine noise, judging angle by the line of the road glimpsed through breaks in the foliage. The 75 mm howitzer was positioned for direct fire, dangerous for any crew, but especially for a single operator whose margin for error was nearly zero. When the lead truck emerged from the bend in the valley, its outline appeared and disappeared between the jungle shadows. The gunner made a final adjustment, tightened his stance, and pulled the lanyard. The recoil slammed the weapon backward, sliding a fraction in the mud, but the round was already on its way. It struck the engine block of the first truck, detonating with a dull, crushing blast. The entire vehicle lifted momentarily before dropping to the road in a plume of smoke and splintered wood. The convoy stopped instantly. Drivers braked, shouted signals vanished into the engine noise, and confusion rippled backward. He had no crew to relay the gun for the second shot, so he moved by instinct and training. He kicked the trail deeper into the soil, dragged the barrel slightly to the left, and loaded another round with the practiced motion of someone who had done this hundreds of times, never alone, but familiar enough to simulate a team. The second shell hit the third truck, the explosion blocking the remaining vehicles in a choke point. Smoke curled upward, mixing with dust and the thick smell of burning fuel. Japanese soldiers scrambled from the backs of the trucks, some running for the tree line, others trying to assess where the fire was coming from. They expected mortars or machine guns. Few immediately recognized the signature of direct artillery fire. It was only after the third round struck, shattering the rear truck and igniting crates of cargo, that the truth became clear. A field gun was firing from the ridge, and it had a clear line of sight on the entire column. For the lone gunner, this moment was both opportunity and danger. The gun's position was now exposed. Muzzle flash from direct fire revealed exactly where he was. Counterfire could follow, but he continued, cycling through rounds with a rhythm slowed only by the limits of a single man's endurance. The fourth shell struck near the center of the column, flipping debris across the road. The fifth hit a fuel drum, sending a sheet of flame rising with a violent roar. Thick black smoke rolled upward, covering the valley in a haze that made movement chaotic for the Japanese troops scrambling to respond. They attempted to deploy light machine guns to suppress the ridge, but the angle was steep, the foliage thick, and the precise position hard to pinpoint. Small arms fire snapped through the branches above the gunner's head, but most rounds struck high or were absorbed by the undergrowth. He stayed low, moving only when necessary, using the gun shield to cover his torso as he adjusted the sights again. A sixth round left the barrel with a sharp crack, hitting another truck that had tried to reverse out of the kill zone. The blast collapsed its wooden frame and scattered equipment across the road. At this point, 7 vehicles had been disabled or destroyed. The entire convoy lay immobilized, some burning, some overturned, all effectively neutralized. The valley's lifeline had been severed in less than 2 minutes. But the gunner knew the Japanese response would escalate quickly. Infantry would begin climbing the slope. Mortar crews would attempt to find an angle to hit the ridge. Snipers, if present, would scan for movement. The urgency that had fueled his rapid firing now shifted into the tension of survival. He crouched behind the shield, catching his breath, loading the next round more slowly as he listened for new threats. It was then he heard the sharp, distant thump of a mortar, a second, then a third. The Japanese had found a way to angle indirect fire toward the ridge. The shells landed with heavy impacts just downslope from the gun, sending showers of earth upward. The next salvo landed closer. The gunner braced himself, shielding his face as fragments tore through the brush around him. He crawled to the ammunition crates, retrieved one more round, and returned to the gun. His arms were trembling now, not from fear but from fatigue. But he kept moving. The 7th shell he fired was aimed not at the convoy, but at the advancing Japanese infantry attempting to climb the slope. It exploded mid-slope, scattering the attack and buying him a few more seconds. He adjusted once more, preparing for another shot when the mortar bursts finally found range. One detonated directly behind the gun, slamming him to the ground. Dirt and splinters rained across the position. He pushed himself upright, ears ringing, vision blurred. He knew he had reached the limit of what one man could do. The gun was still operational. The ridge was still held, and 7 trucks, an entire Japanese supply run, lay destroyed in the valley below, smoke curling upward like a signal to every unit watching. This was the turning point. Not because of the trucks alone, but because the Japanese assault faltered at the exact moment American reinforcements were finally making their way back toward the ridge, drawn by the unmistakable sound of a lone howitzer firing in defiance. And that convergence set the stage for everything that came after. When the smoke began to drift apart over the valley, the full scale of the destruction became visible to both sides. The 7 trucks that had attempted the morning run now lay in various states of ruin, burning frames, collapsed axles, shattered wooden beds, and twisted metal scattered across the narrow road. What had been a lifeline only minutes earlier had become an immovable barrier, choking the entire supply route. Japanese infantry units advancing toward the front received the news almost immediately. The convoy had been hit, the road was blocked, and ammunition would not reach the forward battalions in time. From the American perspective, the sound of the lone howitzer had been the first indication that the ridge was not lost. Scouts moving through the lower slopes heard the pattern of firing, irregular, deliberate, and close. Officers recognized the signature of a pack howitzer being fired in direct support configuration. It was not a pattern produced by a full gun crew. It was the rhythm of one man keeping a weapon alive long after his section had fallen back. That realization spread quickly among the troops attempting to re-establish contact. If a howitzer was still firing, it meant the ridge was still contested. It meant the Japanese had not taken control. And it meant that reaching the height mattered now more than ever. As reinforcements pushed upward, the Japanese response intensified. Mortar teams, frustrated by the steep terrain and limited visibility, continued to bracket the ridge with trial and error fire. Their infantry, denied the supplies the convoy carried, attempted to climb the slope in small groups, hoping to overwhelm the isolated position before American forces arrived, but the destruction in the valley had already altered the tempo of their advance. Units that expected resupply hesitated. Officers recalculated their ammunition expenditure. Runners were sent back to confirm the status of the convoy, slowing coordination at a moment when synchronization was crucial. On the ridge itself, the lone gunner had taken shelter behind a shallow cut in the ground formed by earlier shell impacts. His uniform was torn, and the skin across his arms and face was streaked with dirt and smoke. The gun remained upright, its barrel angled slightly downslope, its metal still hot from the rapid salvo. Spent casings were scattered around the position, mixed with splintered wood from crates shattered by mortar fragments. He had no way of knowing whether reinforcements were coming. The jungle concealed movement as effectively as it concealed danger. But he stayed close to the weapon, refusing to retreat from the last defensible point on the height. When the first American scouts reached the ridge's lower edge, they found signs of the earlier night attack, discarded Japanese gear, shell craters, and footprints converging toward the central gun position. They followed the trail cautiously, expecting to find either a captured weapon or a destroyed emplacement. Instead, they found the howitzer still intact and the gunner crouched beside it, dazed but conscious, refusing evacuation until he confirmed the area was secure. Reports from the scouts described the scene with a mixture of disbelief and respect. One man had maintained a forward artillery position long enough to halt an entire Japanese convoy. For the Japanese, the aftermath was equally stark but viewed through a different lens. Officers inspecting the road found the lead truck buried under debris, the second truck tilted at a steep angle, and subsequent vehicles clustered behind in a chain of wreckage that extended nearly the entire visible stretch of road. Some engines still smoked. Others were silent, their fuel tanks blown open. The losses forced an immediate tactical reassessment. Without the supplies those trucks carried, the planned pressure on the American line had to be scaled back. Units scheduled to launch attacks that afternoon were ordered to hold their current positions instead. In wartime reports compiled later, Japanese officers noted the shock of discovering that the fire had come from a single operational piece left behind after the night's fighting. They described the incident as unexpectedly effective direct fire, and acknowledged that it had disrupted movement for an entire day, rare for a single artillery weapon. The disbelief came not simply from the destruction, but from the knowledge that their earlier assessment of the ridge's status had been incorrect. The night attack had weakened the American position, but it had not decisively neutralized it. One man had prevented the road from opening, and that error in judgment had consequences that cascaded across the front. American commanders, reviewing the action afterward, saw the moment as an example of initiative under extreme pressure. In their summaries, they highlighted how a small tactical action, just one gun, one man, one ridge, had produced strategic effects far greater than the scale of the fight. The destroyed convoy forced the Japanese to reroute supplies on foot, slowing their tempo for days. It also allowed American units to consolidate on the heights and prepare for the next phase of the advance with more security than expected. Casualty estimates from the destroyed convoy varied, as they often did in dense jungle terrain, but historians generally agree that the loss of 7 functioning trucks in a single strike was significant in a theater where motorized transport was never abundant. Each truck represented not just transportation, but manpower, ammunition, rations, and irreplaceable logistical effort, and each truck lost tightened pressure on Japanese frontline units already stretched thin by continuous fighting. The ridge, once seen as vulnerable, became a symbol of resilience for the American units who retook it fully by midday. The gun was carefully repositioned, ammunition redistributed, and new crews assigned. But the story of how it had remained in place, how it had fired until the barrels of smoke rose in thick, unbroken columns over the valley, spread through the battalion with a kind of quiet respect. This aftermath, shaped by wreckage in the valley and the exhaustion on the ridge, marked not just the end of a small engagement, but the beginning of a shift in momentum. And that shift leads directly into the broader reflection on what this moment meant for the soldiers who witnessed it, and the war they were fighting. In the broader scale of the Pacific War, the destruction of 7 trucks on a narrow jungle road was a small event, one among thousands of skirmishes, ambushes, and moments of unexpected resistance. Yet it stands out precisely because of how it unfolded. War is often measured in divisions, campaigns, and sweeping movements of strategy. But the reality experienced by the men on the ground was different. It hinged on moments like this, moments when a single position held or collapsed, when a single gun fired or fell silent, when a lone soldier chose not to abandon a ridge that others believed lost. The ridge itself became a symbol of the war's contradictions. It was a place where exhaustion met discipline, where the limits of individual endurance intersected with the impersonal machinery of logistics. The Japanese convoy represented effort, planning, and necessity, each truck carrying the weight of a frontline counting on resupply. The lone gunner represented something equally important: initiative under pressure, the instinct to keep fighting even when the rational choice might have been to fall back and regroup. Historians often emphasize that in the Pacific, terrain shaped everything. Dense jungle, steep ridges, narrow trails, these features forced armies to fragment into small groups. Guns that were designed for crews of 6 sometimes ended up in the hands of 2 or 1, simply because the terrain isolated them. Commanders could design plans, but the terrain constantly rewrote them. In this environment, individual decisions took on extraordinary weight. The action on the ridge illustrates how a single decision, not to leave, not to abandon the gun, not to surrender a vantage point, could change the tempo of battle far beyond what any one soldier normally influenced. The Japanese disbelief at what happened was rooted not in the destruction itself, but in the realization of what it represented. They were accustomed to facing determined resistance, but the thought that a man, cut off from his unit and left alone in a forward artillery position, would remain and operate a howitzer by himself ran against expectations of how the fight should have unfolded. Their surprise was less about the physical damage and more about the break in predictable patterns. War teaches men to anticipate enemy behavior. But in this case, the unexpected became decisive. For American troops, the event reinforced a truth that had been emerging throughout the campaign: the outcome of battles often rested on the smallest surviving elements. A single foxhole that didn't break, a radio that kept transmitting, a gun that kept firing. These fragments of resilience, multiplied across hundreds of small engagements, gradually shaped the momentum that larger histories later described as inevitable. Looking back, the ridge and the shattered convoy below it serve as a reminder that the Pacific War was not only won in major landings or grand offensives, but in moments where one soldier made a stand that forced the enemy to pause, reconsider, or retreat. The war was determined inch by inch, ridge by ridge, and sometimes shot by shot from a gun that should have fallen silent but didn't. And in that quiet truth lies the enduring meaning of what happened on that morning. When smoke rose from the valley, disbelief echoed through enemy lines, and one man's persistence on a lonely ridge influenced far more than he ever intended.